On July 15, 2022, in the quiet coastal town of San Miguel de Rio in northern Portugal, 6-year-old Emilia Silva vanished. It was a clear, warm afternoon with temperatures hovering around 27 degrees Celsius. The beach was nearly empty, occupied only by a few locals and vacationing families. Antonio and Leah Silva had chosen this secluded spot for a day of calm. They arrived just before noon and settled approximately 10 meters from the water's edge, where Emilia began playing with a small, yellow plastic shovel near the shoreline. The parents had brought snacks, towels, and a sun umbrella. Leah was immersed in a novel, her toes buried in the warm sand. Antonio was responding to emails on his phone. They exchanged occasional glances at their daughter, who remained within what they believed was a safe distance. But at precisely 4:20 p.m., everything changed. Antonio, distracted by a buzzing notification, briefly looked up and froze. Emilia was no longer in sight. His eyes darted across the beach. Leah, sensing his alarm, set down her book and joined him in scanning the area. Panic didn't rise instantly. At first they assumed she had wandered behind a rock or toward the umbrella of a neighbouring family. But as the seconds passed, concern mutated into dread. They began calling out her name, loud at first, then desperate. A couple nearby heard the commotion and joined the search. Within minutes, more beachgoers were combing the sand, but all that remained near the water was a single small barefoot print, clear and isolated, next to her yellow shovel lying undamaged in the wet sand. A few meters to the right, police would later find a faint drag mark in the sand leading toward the surf, as if something or someone had been pulled or moved. The mark was shallow and partly washed away by the tide, making it impossible to determine exactly what had caused it. The object or person was never recovered. Authorities were alerted at 4:32 p.m. and a patrol arrived on site by 4:42. Officers quickly cordoned off the area and began taking statements from witnesses. The first point of scrutiny was the parents' testimonies. Leah believed she last saw Emilia at 4:17 p.m., while Antonio claimed it was closer to 4:19. That minor discrepancy, just 2 minutes, immediately drew attention. Investigators noted it in the report as potentially significant. Those 120 seconds would later become a defining void, an opening through which the unthinkable had slipped. By 5:10 p.m., a deeper search had begun. Officers were joined by members of the GNR, National Republican Guard, and local volunteer groups. They formed lines and swept the beach with increasing urgency. Helicopters with thermal imaging were called in as dusk approached. Despite their efforts, no heat signatures or movement matching Emilia's profile were detected in the surrounding dunes or rocky outcrops. At 6 p.m., a breakthrough of sorts occurred. A torn piece of blue cloth was found in a bush 20 meters from the last footprint. The material was consistent with a nylon windbreaker. Witnesses mentioned that a local teenager, often seen hanging around the pier, owned a similar jacket. However, the discovery was inconclusive. The cloth bore no blood, hair, or clear DNA. Nevertheless, it was placed into evidence. As shadows stretched across the sand and daylight waned, the atmosphere grew thick with unease. Volunteers, once hopeful, fell into quiet labour. A makeshift command centre was set up near the beach entrance, with a whiteboard tracking the timeline and a list of leads and open questions. Antonio and Leah remained seated near the last known location of their daughter, physically still but visibly unravelling. Antonio stared toward the waves with hollow eyes, clenching and unclenching his fists. Leah whispered Emilia's name under her breath repeatedly, a soft chant that seemed to hold her upright. By 9 p.m., most beachgoers had been cleared. The scene was now populated solely by law enforcement, flashlight beams darting across dunes and water alike. A cold breeze had begun to rise from the ocean, and the ambient noises of the evening, seagulls' waves, felt eerily intrusive. At 11:55 p.m., a volunteer diver, part of a professional rescue team, who had been exploring the crevices of Vintage Rock, 400 metres from the main beach, reported spotting something between the rocks. He couldn't identify it clearly due to the darkness, but it was described as unnatural in shape and texture. The area where the diver had been searching was extremely difficult to access without equipment and not visible from the beach. Law enforcement officers moved quickly but discreetly. They decided not to inform the parents just yet, fearing the emotional consequences if the discovery turned out to be unrelated. The team redirected their resources toward Vintage Rock, scanning the surrounding boulders and crevices. Investigators marked the location and sealed it off with temporary barriers. The waves crashed below as the tide began to creep upward. Under dim light and heavy silence, forensic photographers documented the scene while other officers sifted through the gravel and pools near the ledge. What they found was immediately classified. Back at the main beach, Antonio and Leah were asked to accompany officers for a routine update. They were taken to a nearby guest house where detectives gently asked them to recount the day's events in more detail. Antonio stumbled through his responses, alternating between moments of lucidity and paralyzing grief. Leah remained composed, though visibly detached, as if her consciousness were suspended somewhere between hope and despair. As midnight passed and the date changed to July 16th, the beach stood empty, cloaked in darkness. Police tape fluttered in the wind, searchlights flickered in the distance. The once peaceful coastline had transformed into a place of unanswered questions and rising suspicion. That night, no one slept. Not the parents, not the officers, not the residents of San Miguel de Rio, who locked their doors and windows with trembling hands and whispered prayers for a little girl who, just hours earlier, had been playing by the sea. The investigation had only just begun, but already beneath the surface of Emilia Silva's disappearance, deeper and darker truths were beginning to stir. The morning of July 16th arrived, but there was no sense of renewal. The town of San Miguel de Rio awoke to a dull grey sky and a growing sense of unease. Word of Emilia's disappearance had spread through hushed conversations in cafes, over fences, and in church pews. Flyers with her photograph, a smiling child with chestnut hair and bright eyes, were already printed by early risers and taped to streetlights, storefronts, and parked cars. Meanwhile, at the police station, the lead detective assigned to the case, Inspector Mariana Cruz, reviewed the previous night's findings. The object recovered from Vintage Rock had been formally identified during the early hours. It was Emilia. The official announcement had been carefully crafted, devoid of graphic details. The family was notified gently and away from public view. Antonio collapsed upon hearing the confirmation, while Leah didn't react at all. She just stared at the floor, blinking slowly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A counsellor was brought in, but she spoke very little. The grief was raw, unprocessed, and had no room for language. As police began shifting their operation from search to full-scale investigation, forensic teams returned to Vintage Rock. They examined not only the immediate area where the body was discovered, but also the cliff paths leading down to the shoreline. One set of smudged footprints was found on a mossy ledge. Forensics noted the pattern, barefoot, heel-heavy and light, likely belonging to a small child. These matched Emilia's size, but there was more. A partial fingerprint was discovered on one of the larger flat stones near where Emilia had been found. It was faint, but the print was complete enough to run through the national database. It did not match either parent. It also didn't match any known offenders from the surrounding region. However, a second, smaller print, less complete, did return a hit. 2 years ago, a petty theft involving a stolen bicycle in the town's centre had yielded a fingerprint belonging to a man named Luis Martinez. Luis, 27, unemployed with a scattered history of minor disturbances, had been seen on July 14th walking alone near the fishing docks. Several locals recalled him vaguely. He wasn't a fixture in the town, but wasn't a total stranger either. Described as quiet, sometimes strange, he often loitered near the promenade or sat on benches sketching in a small notebook. Detectives immediately pivoted toward him. They needed to know where Luis had been between 3:30 p.m. and 5 p.m. on July 15th. Interviews began. Neighbours were questioned. Some said they had seen Luis walking alone on the rocky path that bordered the coastline. One woman recalled that he often took photographs of seabirds and sunsets. No one remembered seeing him with Emilia or near the family. But the timelines were incomplete. The area between the beach and Vintage Rock had limited camera coverage. Investigators then turned to the local bar, Casa Marinero. It was perched above the beach and had an exterior security camera pointing toward the entrance and the descending trail. The owners cooperated fully. Surveillance footage from July 15th was examined frame by frame. At exactly 3:40 p.m, the fisherman who had initially aroused suspicion was seen entering the bar. He ordered a coffee and sat silently at the counter. He left at 4:10 p.m. The receipt and time-stamped register logs matched. It was physically impossible for him to reach the beach by 4:20 p.m. when Emilia vanished. This, along with the forensic analysis of the blood found on his boat, identified as fish blood, cleared him entirely. Still, investigators remained puzzled. If the fisherman was no longer a suspect and Luis's print was on a stone near the body, why had Luis denied being anywhere near the beach? They had no hard evidence placing him at the scene during the window of time when Emilia disappeared. Officers brought Luis in for questioning. He appeared nervous but cooperative. He insisted he had not been on the beach that day, nor near Vintage Rock. He explained that he often walked along the cliffs in the early mornings or late evenings, and that his fingerprints on a rock didn't mean anything. The tone of the interview shifted subtly when detectives asked him about a small notebook that witnesses had mentioned. Luis hesitated, but eventually handed it over. The notebook contained a series of handwritten observations, descriptions of people, times, locations. It looked like a log. Some entries were random and harmless: birds, cloud shapes, boats. But one section was more structured. It documented families. How long they stayed on the beach, where they sat, what toys their children brought. One name appeared repeatedly: Emilia. Her name was circled in red ink. When asked to explain, Luis said he liked writing things down, that he found it calming, that it was a form of distraction from his unemployment. He denied following any particular person. His answers were soft, uncertain. He didn't raise his voice, but his responses lacked clarity. The officers confiscated the notebook and marked it as evidence. The fact that Emilia's name appeared so frequently and uniquely underlined struck investigators as odd, even if it wasn't on its own a crime. Still, Luis was released for lack of grounds to hold him, but under active surveillance. Later that day, forensic technicians discovered additional details at Vintage Rock. A few long, fine hairs were recovered near the ledge. DNA analysis was underway, but it would take days. In the meantime, detectives built a timeline. They mapped out distances, walking speeds, elevation changes and sightlines. From the beach to Vintage Rock took about 7-9 minutes on foot, if one knew the trail. The windmill, Emilia's favourite toy, was found the next morning wedged into a crevice at the foot of a boulder. Its colourful veins had snapped, and a fingerprint smudged with sea salt was recovered from the stick. Police reviewed Emilia's digital footprint. Her parents had taken photos that afternoon, one of which showed Emilia at 4:12 p.m. her back to the camera, holding the windmill near the water. Forensic analysts enhanced the image and zoomed into the background. A figure, partially obscured behind a dune, was visible. It was impossible to identify the person, but the silhouette's size and posture did not match either parent. The town had become a fortress of speculation. Rumours spread rapidly. Every neighbour, every passer-by became a suspect in someone's eyes. The church held a vigil that evening, drawing almost every resident. Candles flickered against the stained glass windows. Leah remained inside for nearly an hour after everyone had left, staring blankly at the flickering flame of a single candle she had lit for Emilia. Back in the command centre, the caseboard was becoming more complex, coloured strings connecting people, places, times. Luis Martinez's photo now stood beside Emilia's, pinned with red thread. The windmill, the notebook, the footprint, the fingerprint, they were starting to cohere into a story. But no one dared say it aloud, not yet. The investigation wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about the unbearable weight of a single unanswered question. And as each hour passed, that question grew heavier. By July 17th, Luis Martinez was under quiet but continuous surveillance. Officers tracked his movements from a distance, noting that he rarely left his home and appeared increasingly withdrawn. He lived in a small second-floor apartment above a shuttered photography shop. His curtains remained closed, and he interacted with no one. When he did step outside, usually late at night, he took long, slow walks along the coastline, always alone, always with his hood up. Investigators reviewed phone records, internet searches and bank transactions. Luis had no stable employment, no recent travel, and no known close relationships. He owned a basic smartphone and a prepaid SIM card, which showed minimal activity on July 15th. No calls, no texts, no GPS services active. But a low battery alert at 5:18 p.m. pinged the nearest tower just north of Vantage Rock, lending silent support to the growing theory. Meanwhile, the notebook Luis had kept became a focal point for psychological experts. Police brought in a behavioural analyst from Lisbon to interpret the entries. Her findings added a new layer to the investigation. Luis's observations, while sparse in emotion, demonstrated a systematic pattern of focus. Over 2 weeks his writings charted Emilia's family habits, arrival times, favourite beach spots, even the colour of her mother's towel. But what was more troubling was what wasn't written. There were no entries for July 15th, the day Emilia disappeared. The last dated entry was July 14th, as if something had ended or begun on that missing page. The behavioural profile suggested obsessive preoccupation, not with Emilia personally, but with the idea of family and routine, something Luis may have once had and lost. Background checks confirmed a tragic history. In 2020, he had a young daughter who drowned in a reservoir outside Porto. The case had been ruled accidental. His partner left him shortly after. Since then, Luis had bounced between towns, never holding a job for more than a few months. He had received no formal psychiatric treatment. While that insight offered a potential emotional motive, it didn't explain the physical evidence. Investigators needed to confirm whether Luis had been present at Vantage Rock at the precise time Emilia disappeared. To that end, digital forensic experts were brought in to extract residual GPS and movement data from Luis's phone, even from deactivated or background applications. It was painstaking work, but late on the evening of July 17th, they recovered fragments of geolocation data that placed him within 300 metres of Vantage Rock at 4:16 p.m. on July 15th. That discovery wasn't enough to arrest him, but it confirmed what many already feared. The following morning, the forensic lab delivered another piece of the puzzle. A partial DNA profile collected from the broken windmill stick was matched to Luis with a 99.92% probability. The results were conclusive enough to escalate the case. At 11:45 a.m. on July 18th, police obtained a warrant and entered Luis's apartment. He didn't resist. Officers described him as distant, eerily calm. Inside, the apartment was meticulously clean but impersonal. No decorations, no family photographs. One room had only a chair, a desk, and a stack of books on sea life and tidal patterns. On a shelf above the bed was a folded piece of children's artwork, a paper sun with rays made of yellow handprints. It had the name Lucia written in crayon. Investigators took it into evidence. While officers conducted the search, Luis sat quietly in the kitchen sipping from a chipped mug. He asked only one question. "Will it be long?" Among his belongings, police discovered a second notebook. This one was much older and water-damaged. It had been kept in a shoebox under the bed. Inside were pages from 2020, filled with short, broken thoughts, as if written in grief. No mention of Emilia, no plans. But the handwriting was unmistakable. In several places the phrase "the sea gives and takes" had been written and underlined. Luis was taken to the station for formal questioning. This time the tone was different. Investigators presented the GPS evidence, the fingerprint, the DNA from the windmill, and the behavioural analysis. Luis listened without interrupting. He didn't protest or deny. When asked directly, "Were you at Vintage Rock with Emilia on the 15th?" he responded only, "I don't remember." The lead detective leaned forward. "But your DNA was there." Luis looked down. "Then I suppose I was." He never confessed. Not fully. His answers remained vague, evasive, but with no effort to clear his name. At the same time, a second team continued reviewing witness testimonies. A local boy named Thomas, aged 15, had originally been considered due to the discovery of blue fabric. When re-interviewed, Thomas clarified that he had lost his blue windbreaker months ago. His mother, contacted by video call, confirmed he had been home with her during the afternoon of July 15th, visible in a family video call with his older brother. With that, this lead was officially closed, but then came a surprise. On July 19th, a neighbour of Luis contacted police. She recalled that on the afternoon of Emilia's disappearance, she had seen Luis walking down the trail toward Vintage Rock around 3 p.m, but just behind him at a distance was another man, taller, wearing a black hood, carrying a camera. Detectives feared a second unknown party. Within hours, they traced the figure through community tips. He was identified as a nature photographer from Porto, visiting the region. His name was Marco Andrade, and he had documented much of his hike on social media. His camera logs confirmed timestamps and GPS data, as did his metadata from over 200 photographs. Not only was he nowhere near Emilia or Luis's last known locations, but several images showed clear views of the coast, empty of any activity. This lead, too, was closed. Still, the cumulative evidence pointed in only one direction. On July 20th, forensic divers were dispatched to Vintage Rock for one final sweep. Using sonar and underwater cameras, they mapped every submerged crevice. They discovered a small depression between two submerged stones, just deep enough to hold a child's body. The shape of the rock, tide patterns and trace residues supported a grim conclusion. Luis had likely chosen the location not just for its isolation, but because he knew the rising tide would erase his traces. As these findings were compiled into the final case report, the town of San Miguel de Rio changed. Tourists stopped coming, the beach emptied. Businesses posted signs reading, "We remember Emilia." Leah and Antonio remained in their home, shielded from the public by relatives. Leah no longer read. Antonio had deleted his phone's social media apps and rarely spoke to anyone outside investigators. Their world had collapsed in seconds. Now everything was divided into before and after. The questions still lingered, but the facts had begun to solidify. A man with a quiet life and a private pain had crossed a line no one could have foreseen. And behind that act, a family was shattered, a community broken, and a town forever marked by a footprint in the sand and a silence that refused to fade. In the days that followed, the investigation turned from evidence-gathering to case-building. Every detail mattered now, not just for police records, but for the judicial process that loomed ahead. Prosecutors needed a full reconstruction. A minute-by-minute breakdown of Luis Martinez's actions on July 15th. Emilia's parents were not called back in for further questioning, but they were informed through intermediaries that the investigation had reached a critical stage. Leah received the news with a quiet nod, while Antonio simply turned toward the window and stayed there for hours. Friends tried to visit but were turned away gently. The family's home, once filled with Emilia's drawings and the distant echo of laughter, now echoed only with silence. The prosecution's efforts intensified. On July 23rd, an extensive timeline was finalized. GPS data from Luis's phone showed a movement pattern that followed the rocky coastline from the cliffs toward Vintage Rock, aligning precisely with the time of Emilia's disappearance. Police mapped the terrain and conducted walking tests with officers of similar build. The result confirmed that Luis could easily cover the 400-metre stretch from the trail to the ledge in less than 9 minutes. An animation was created for the courtroom, showing his movement from the last confirmed sighting to the point of discovery. It depicted how the path curved through brush, passed behind large boulders, and narrowed dangerously at the rock's edge. It also showed where the diver had first seen something glinting in the moonlight, the edge of a child's hair trapped between the rocks. The stone found near Emilia was re-examined in a controlled lab environment. It weighed 4.2 kilograms, rough-edged, with traces of seawater and lichen. Most importantly, it bore fingerprints, partial but multiple. All identifiable prints belonged to Luis. Investigators determined that one of the impressions showed pressure consistent with a grip used to lift or swing the stone. A psychological profile was compiled for the prosecution by a forensic psychiatrist who had met with Luis on 3 occasions. In her report, she wrote that Luis exhibited signs of unresolved trauma, prolonged social isolation, and a fixation on the symbolic restoration of control through targeted observation. He was not suffering from hallucinations, nor was he legally insane. But he had developed an internal narrative that framed happy families not as a source of comfort, but as reminders of what he had lost. Luis refused all further cooperation. He did not confess, did not deny, and made no formal statement. The authorities had enough evidence to proceed. On July 28th, he was formally charged with aggravated homicide and obstruction of justice. The courtroom was sealed off from public access during the preliminary hearings. Antonio and Leah did not attend. Their legal representative informed the court that the family had chosen to grieve in private. The hearings began in early February of the following year. The courtroom was stark, clinical, and filled with tension. Luis sat behind reinforced glass, his expression blank, his shoulders slightly hunched. Cameras were not permitted inside, but a court artist captured the outlines of the scene. A young man, alone, facing the weight of a town's sorrow. The prosecutor opened with a chronology. Emilia's last known location, the timing of the disappearance, the discovery at Vintage Rock, and the trail of evidence, digital, physical and psychological, that led to Luis. Testimony was given by forensic analysts, digital technicians, and the diver who had made the initial discovery.
The diver's voice cracked when he described the moment he recognized a small hand beneath the rocks. "I knew it instantly," he said. "You don't forget something like that."
Then came the behavioral analyst. She walked the court through Luis's notebook, page by page, showing the evolution of his entries from general observations to specific notes about Emilia. "It was not spontaneous," she explained. "It was patterned, methodical, calculated. He may not have written what he intended to do, but the intent to observe and record was clear." The most difficult part of the trial came when the prosecutor played the enhanced photograph taken by Emilia's father at 4:12 p.m., the one with the windmill. On the courtroom screen, a blurred silhouette appeared behind the dune, barely visible. A figure leaning forward, head down. When compared with Luis's known clothing and posture, the match was highly probable. Luis remained unmoved. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. His court-appointed defense attorney had little room to maneuver. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the diary was merely an odd hobby, and that grief had made Luis mentally fragile, not dangerous. But the prosecution pressed on. They revealed a final piece of evidence, the underwater analysis of vintage rock. Oceanographers had simulated the tide levels on the evening of July 15th. The data showed that the tide rose just enough, 28 to 32 centimetres, to submerge the ledge between 7 o'clock and 9 p.m., obscuring all visible signs. Whoever placed Emilia there had knowledge of the ocean's timing. Among Luis's seized belongings was a worn field guide titled Tide Patterns of the Iberian Peninsula.
The psychiatrist, called to testify last, delivered her conclusion calmly. He knew what he was doing. He made no attempt to ask for help. He left a child alone in a place he knew the sea would claim. This was not a moment of rage. It was a calculated action by a man consumed by his own despair.
Luis's attorney offered no rebuttal. There was nothing more to say. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The verdict was unanimous. Luis Martinez was found guilty of all charges. The judge's sentence was stern but deliberate. 25 years of incarceration with compulsory psychiatric treatment during his sentence. Luis showed no emotion. He stood briefly, nodded once and sat back down. But then, just as the courtroom began to clear, a sudden movement startled everyone. Luis reached into his sleeve and pulled out a narrow blade. He moved fast, toward his own throat, but the guards were faster. 2 officers tackled him immediately, disarming him before he could complete the motion. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The judge called for recess. Medical staff treated a superficial cut on Luis's neck. The weapon had been missed during intake, an error that would be investigated separately. He was returned to holding, now under suicide watch. Later, after calm returned, the judge reconvened the court and reaffirmed the sentence. There were no appeals, no statements, just a closing of the file and the cold echo of a gavel. Outside, the town remained quiet. On the beach, a memorial cross stood near where Emilia's footprint had once been. Visitors left flowers, windmills and seashells. The tide came and went over and over, but some marks, those made in memory, in pain and in love, never truly wash away. Mozartstrasse, 25 Linz. From the outside, it was a modest building, like many others on the quiet streets of this Austrian city. But on the top floor was the workspace of Leo Einer, a young man whose face was recognized far beyond the city limits. Leo had built a name for himself in the modeling world, frequently appearing in advertising campaigns and fashion magazines. But 18 days ago, Leo vanished without a trace. When authorities eventually forced open the door to his studio, what they discovered was both unexpected and unsettling. The room had been meticulously sealed with vapor-resistant film covering every surface, from floor to ceiling, including walls, doors and windows. The air itself felt heavy, carrying an unusual and pungent odour. When crime scene specialists entered with detection equipment, a reading of 90 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide was recorded, suggesting the environment had been deliberately engineered for a specific purpose. In the centre of the studio, Leo was found. The condition in which he was discovered left investigators deeply puzzled. His face and hands appeared to have been exposed to a strong substance that altered his appearance, making him nearly unrecognizable. It wasn't clear whether this had been self-administered or caused by someone else, but the implication was obvious. Someone had taken calculated steps to conceal both identity and events. The police immediately sealed off the premises. Whoever had been involved had made a concerted effort to eliminate traces, timing things in a way that Leo's discovery would only come well after his disappearance. Investigators quickly confirmed that the last signal from Leo's phone had been captured by a local cell tower on Mozartstrasse at 10:14 p.m., exactly 18 days earlier. Since that moment, the device had been shut off entirely. Neighbours recalled an unusual mechanical noise that night, like a compressor running continuously, and some noted a strange chemical-like scent in the stairwell. Despite a rainstorm raging outside that evening, Leo's jacket, found inside the studio, was completely dry. That small detail told investigators he had not stepped out for several hours before his disappearance. As forensic teams combed the space, they discovered a key piece of evidence: a fingerprint on a glass ashtray. It didn't match Leo's, nor did it belong to anyone close to him. While it wasn't enough to identify someone conclusively, it provided a starting point. It indicated the presence of someone who had been in contact with Leo in the days leading up to the incident. Two individuals quickly emerged as central to the investigation. The first was David Scher, a neighbour and professional makeup artist whose apartment shared a wall with Leo's studio. David reported having last seen Leo about 3 weeks earlier. He claimed Leo had appeared tense and hurried, as if rushing somewhere. Scher's account was calm and seemingly credible, but it lacked detail, nothing that could be confirmed or contradicted. The second person of interest was Max Holzel, manager of a prominent modelling agency in Vienna. Max told investigators that Leo had flown to Milan for a casting and was expected to return the same night. According to Max, Leo's failure to reappear was likely due to scheduling confusion or a last-minute change in plans. But that explanation began to unravel under scrutiny. Phone records revealed that Max had called Leo 3 times on the night he supposedly left for Italy. If Max truly believed Leo was abroad, the calls made little sense. Moreover, neither the airport authorities nor border officials had any record of Leo leaving Austria during the time frame in question. It became evident that the Milan story had been fabricated, either to confuse the investigation or to conceal something deeper. Then came the discovery that altered the course of the case. Forensic specialists examining Leo's belongings found a sleep mask on the nightstand. In the lab, traces of chloroform were detected on the fabric. This particular substance requires special authorization to obtain and could not have come from Leo himself. Using batch identification markers, authorities were able to trace its point of sale, pharmacy code 214187AT. The trail now led directly to the person who had purchased it. This piece of evidence confirmed one thing: Leo had been moved or affected within his own studio, likely while unaware of the situation. Someone had arrived prepared with materials and a plan, and had carried it out with precision. The goal appeared to be not only to delay discovery, but to prevent the full truth from ever being known. As the first phase of the investigation concluded, authorities narrowed their focus to 2 suspects: David Scher, the quiet neighbour whose proximity gave him opportunity, and Max Holzel, the agency manager whose misleading account raised more questions than answers. Each had access, each had motive, and now each faced growing scrutiny under the weight of the emerging evidence. The central question for police remained: who had gone to such lengths to alter Leo's appearance, and why? The deeper the investigation went, the more it uncovered about the motives and actions of someone determined to stay hidden in the background. The once believable story of Leo's trip to Milan was steadily falling apart. What once seemed like a plausible explanation began to reveal itself as a calculated attempt to mislead authorities. To uncover the truth, investigators began questioning those closest to Leo. His parents, Maria and Thomas Einer, willingly shared their recent messages with their son. One particular message stood out. Leo had written to his mother just a day before his disappearance, informing her that the Milan trip was no longer happening. He didn't provide any details, and for Maria, it didn't raise any alarms. In the fast-moving modelling industry, last-minute cancellations were not unusual. But there was a discrepancy. Leo hadn't formally cancelled his travel plans. When police followed up with Austrian Airlines, they confirmed that a ticket in his name had indeed been issued. Yet a strange detail caught their attention. The ticket had been paid for using a virtual banking card that didn't trigger an actual transaction. This meant the reservation was essentially just for show, a digital footprint meant to support the illusion that Leo was about to travel. This revelation turned the focus back to Max Holzel, Leo's agency manager. Investigators wanted to know why Max had so firmly insisted that Leo had flown to Milan, despite growing evidence to the contrary. The airport had no record of his departure, and the ticket appeared to be a fabrication. When confronted, Max responded with apparent calm. He claimed he was only repeating what Leo had told him and that he hadn't personally confirmed the flight or itinerary. The investigators, determined to uncover the truth, secured authorization from the Linz District Court to search the offices of Max's modelling agency in Vienna. Among the files and communications, they discovered one document that stood out, a file named milancastingleo.pdf. At first glance, it appeared legitimate. The agency's logo neatly outlined dates, venue information, and even the branding of a well-known fashion label, all standard components of a professional casting notice. But further scrutiny revealed something troubling. The brand mentioned in the document didn't exist. The entire file turned out to be fabricated. Even with this suspicious document in hand, authorities continued to verify every lead. The most surprising turn came when they examined Max's own movements on the night of Leo's disappearance. Records from border control at Prague Airport showed Max had officially entered the Czech Republic at 10:35 p.m., just 21 minutes after Leo's phone went silent. Investigators double-checked travel times and methods. Max had taken Eurocity train 176, which ran a route of approximately 280 kilometres over 3 hours and 40 minutes. The ticket had been purchased in advance, suggesting a planned journey rather than an impromptu attempt to establish an alibi. Everything matched. Max had left Austria by train well before the crucial window in Leo's case, and all available evidence confirmed it. So despite the questionable document and misleading statements, Max Holzel had a confirmed and legally supported alibi. His involvement, while suspicious in some aspects, could not be tied directly to the timing of Leo's disappearance. With Max effectively ruled out, investigators turned their attention to the only other significant person of interest, David Scher, the quiet neighbour and makeup artist. Up to this point, David had managed to stay relatively under the radar. His statements had been calm and general, but now the investigative focus shifted squarely onto him. A closer review of Leo's private messages revealed that his relationship with David had not been as cordial as initially assumed. Some of their exchanges hinted at underlying tension, subtle messages that pointed to unresolved conflict or strained communication. These findings gave investigators a new direction to pursue. By the end of the day, a clearer picture had begun to form. The story of the casting trip had been a carefully orchestrated distraction, and although Max was eventually cleared of involvement in the disappearance itself, he still could not explain who had created the fabricated document or why Leo had been led to believe in an event that never existed. With that mystery still unresolved, investigators redirected their attention to Leo's surroundings in Linz. It soon became clear that the real answers were far closer than originally believed. Each new clue narrowed the focus. Then came a major breakthrough. Investigators began a comprehensive review of the life and activities of David Scher, Leo's neighbour. What they uncovered raised several red flags. Just 4 days before Leo disappeared, Scher had unexpectedly submitted a request for a restricted license to purchase hydrofluoric acid. It was a puzzling move for someone with a professional background in makeup artistry, an industry that had no connection to the use of such substances. The timing alone drew attention, but the nature of the chemical made the request particularly unusual. A search of David's apartment was authorized and carried out. There, investigators discovered a number of concerning items. Among his makeup kits and professional tools, an empty glass bottle labelled chloroform was found. Forensic specialists quickly traced the origin of the bottle and confirmed that it belonged to the exact same pharmacy batch, code 214187AT, as the substance found on Leo's sleep mask. This was no coincidence. For the first time, investigators had clear physical evidence linking David Sher to materials present at the scene. That wasn't all. In the hallway, authorities found shipping documents from a chemical supply company based in the nearby town of Traun. The delivery notes confirmed that David had received a shipment containing 11 kilograms of hydrofluoric acid at 40% concentration and 5 kilograms of sulfuric acid. The forms were signed by Sher himself and dated September 19th, just one day after Leo had last been in contact. This timeline strongly suggested a premeditated action. When brought in for questioning, Sher remained composed, though visibly irritated by the attention. When asked about the purpose of acquiring such chemicals, he responded quickly, claiming he intended to use them to clean old photographic cassettes, which he said had developed oxide buildup. It was an explanation that appeared rehearsed, yet it lacked supporting evidence. Investigators had already conducted a detailed search of his apartment. Not a single photographic cassette was found, nor were any of the specific tools or protective materials needed to handle such substances safely, especially hydrofluoric acid, which requires highly specialized, non-reactive equipment. Experts confirmed that attempting to use the acid without such precautions would be impractical and dangerous. David's explanation no longer held up under scrutiny. As the investigation built momentum, a new piece of evidence added an unexpected twist. Forensic experts analyzing one of the chemical containers discovered a second DNA profile. This profile did not belong to Leo or to David Sher. When run through national law enforcement databases, it returned no matches. The discovery indicated the presence of another unknown individual, someone who had not yet been identified in the case. For now, the investigators could only mark this as an important lead. The mystery participant had not yet come into view, but their involvement was now undeniable. Meanwhile, new findings from the forensic lab added another strange layer to the case. Analysts discovered that, prior to any chemical exposure, Leo had been subjected to an elevated heat source. Thermometric analysis of the materials in the room showed exposure to a temperature of around 65 degrees Celsius. The purpose of this heat application was not immediately clear, but it appeared to be intentional and carefully controlled. The possibility emerged that the heating had been part of a separate procedure entirely, perhaps related to staging or altering the environment. Though its exact purpose remained uncertain, it showed yet another level of planning and precision behind the actions taken in the studio. At this stage, David Sher became acutely aware of the mounting evidence. Still, he insisted he had no involvement in Leo's disappearance. Despite this, investigators intensified their efforts to uncover the missing links. A more detailed examination of the ventilation system in the building on Mozartstrasse was initiated. Inside the ductwork, investigators discovered an unusual item, a homemade F7 class air filter, something rarely found in residential settings. Upon microscopic analysis, the filter was found to contain trace particles of cosmetic materials, tiny fibers and pigments typically used in professional makeup. This unexpected clue suggested that someone had used the building's ventilation system either to alter airflow or to obscure chemical activity. It also pointed once again to someone with both access and knowledge of cosmetic materials, someone like David Sher. The threads of the case were beginning to tighten. The investigators were drawing closer to the answers that had eluded them for weeks. Laboratory spectral analysis confirmed a match between the cosmetic particles found in the ventilation filter and the professional products stored in David Sher's makeup kit. The presence of those substances within a specially installed filter made it clear it had been deliberately positioned to trap airborne particles released during the setup or execution of the event. The evidence pointed to a careful and intentional act. Around the same time, forensic experts were able to identify the person behind the previously unknown DNA sample found on one of the chemical containers. The DNA belonged to Eva Meyer, a former assistant and co-worker of David's at a local makeup salon. Interestingly, Eva herself contacted law enforcement after hearing about the case in the news. She voluntarily offered to provide a statement. During her questioning, Eva clearly explained her limited involvement. She had supplied David with empty containers for routine recycling, a common practice in their workspace. Investigators cross-checked her account thoroughly and found no inconsistencies or cause for concern. With her version confirmed, the mystery surrounding the third DNA profile was resolved, and Eva Meyer was no longer viewed as a person of interest. Still, one puzzling element remained unresolved: the unusual heating that had taken place in Leo's studio. To understand it, investigators consulted top forensic specialists from the Viennes Institute of Forensic Medicine. The team offered two possible theories. The first suggested that the heating might have been part of a strategic attempt to dry the environment before chemical exposure, perhaps with the intention of slowing down biological breakdown and complicating later identification. Such a method would indicate a calculated approach to controlling the scene. The second theory was more technical. Specialists believed the heating may have been used to dry the polyethylene sheeting that had been used to line the studio. A dry barrier would have helped trap vapours in the space more effectively, extending their presence and intensifying their impact. From an operational standpoint, this explanation appeared more grounded, and investigators considered it the most likely scenario. Meanwhile, the media began to speculate about Eva Meyer's involvement. Fueled by the initial DNA match, some outlets portrayed her as a possible accomplice. In response to growing public curiosity, police moved to formally verify her whereabouts on the night in question. Detailed checks confirmed that Eva had been teaching a makeup workshop at a vocational training institute on the same day Leo vanished. The class was not only streamed live but also recorded by the school's internal surveillance system, equipment that fully complied with updated security standards. Investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame and verified her attendance throughout the session. Her presence was officially documented, and the suspicion cast by the public was laid to rest. Eva was formally cleared and removed from any connection to the case. As attention returned to David Scher, police forensic teams completed their review of the electronics seized from his apartment. One device, a laptop, yielded a deeply concerning clue. Within its cache, investigators found a search query that read, "Blind with acid but alive." While the system metadata was damaged and the exact date of the search could not be recovered, the fact that the phrase had been typed on that machine was confirmed. This unsettling discovery suggested that the intent behind the act may have been even more severe than initially believed. It hinted at a plan that might have aimed to inflict long-term harm, though not all aspects had come to pass. Regardless, the nature of the search aligned with a deliberate and premeditated mindset. Now the investigators focused on solidifying the timeline and motive. What once seemed disjointed, the filter, the chemicals, the heat, the digital evidence, now formed a coherent and intentional sequence. The chain of events pointed to an act that had been planned down to the smallest detail. 3 months after Leo Egner was found, the investigation neared its conclusion. Authorities had pieced together the entire series of events and the rationale behind them. The evidence clearly and directly pointed to David Scher, Leo's next-door neighbour and fellow professional in the beauty industry. It was a betrayal from someone within his circle, and it had culminated in one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. In the final phase of the investigation, additional clues helped corroborate the narrative. Unusual green-tinted residue, matching materials found in Cher's studio, was discovered along a secluded ravine behind Rosalia de Castro Street. Subtle drag marks were noted in the soil, indicating that something had been moved through the area, adding one last piece to a puzzle investigators had now fully assembled. It may have been an act that was not only carefully planned, but also rooted in deeply personal emotions, perhaps jealousy, perhaps unresolved resentment. On the night of September 18th, around 9:30 p.m, David Cher invited Leo to his apartment with the suggestion of a creative nighttime photo shoot. Leo, unaware of any hidden motive, accepted the invitation willingly. He had no reason to be suspicious, but once inside, David handed him a sleep mask treated with a chemical substance. From that moment on, Leo had no ability to intervene or resist. Not long after, David received a shipment of substances he had previously ordered. Investigators later confirmed that the materials were delivered shortly after the incident. The acquisition documents, the restricted license and detailed invoices from the Chem Logistics Company served as solid proof of deliberate preparation. Nothing about it appeared spontaneous. Early in the case, a fingerprint had been recovered from an ashtray at the scene. Forensic analysis ultimately confirmed it belonged to Cher. This directly contradicted his earlier claims that he hadn't been to Leo's apartment in weeks. One by one, the claims he had made to investigators began to fall apart. Any effort David had made to construct an alibi was similarly dismantled. Data from bank cards, customer loyalty accounts, and local surveillance records all showed he had remained in Linz continuously from the evening of September 18th onward. He had not left the city, not even briefly, at any point following Leo's disappearance. These patterns further supported the theory that the act had been both localized and intentional. But it was the final piece of digital evidence that deeply unsettled investigators. When they analyzed the contents of Cher's laptop, they found a disturbing search query stored in the browser cache, blind with acid but alive. Though the metadata surrounding the query had been corrupted and could not be time-stamped, its presence alone offered insight into David's state of mind. Experts interpreted the search not only as a disturbing reflection of intent, but also as a sign of a deeply fixated and troubled mindset. The evidence, by now overwhelming, indicated that David's goal had not simply been to remove someone from his life. It had been to inflict long-term visible harm. Investigators suggested that jealousy, possibly fueled by professional rivalry and unresolved tension surrounding his former colleague Eva Meyer, played a key role in his motive. Once the full body of evidence had been compiled, law enforcement arranged a formal confrontation. At first, David remained silent, refusing to answer any questions. But when investigators presented all the data, his fingerprints, chemical orders, movement records and digital traces, his composure cracked. In a sudden act of distress, he attempted to harm himself using a pen from the interrogation table. Fortunately, security intervened in time, and no lasting injuries occurred. However, the moment left a lasting impression on everyone present. For many, it was the final indicator of guilt. On November 25th, 2024, the final court session took place at the Regional Court of Linz, under case number 27123. The trial had drawn considerable attention from both media outlets and the public, and tensions in the courtroom ran high. The court found no mitigating circumstances and, after reviewing all material evidence, issued its ruling. According to Articles 75 and 176 of the Austrian Criminal Code, David Cher was found guilty on all charges brought against him. The sentence was clear and unambiguous: life imprisonment. Following the verdict, all documentation related to the case was formally submitted to the Regional Criminal Police Archive of Upper Austria under official index number LKOE 27123. The investigation had reached its conclusion. Leo Einer, an ambitious and talented young man, became a tragic example of how destructive suppressed emotions can become. His story is remembered by his loved ones and the broader community as one filled with promise, unfairly and suddenly taken away. The event served as a stark reminder of how important it is to recognize early signs of emotional distress in those around us. Justice had been served, the truth had been uncovered, and a powerful lesson had been left behind for families, for communities, and for the system itself.